Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Harley Erdman. My pronouns are he, him. I am chair of the UMass Department of Theater, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to the third in our series, Women in Theatrical Design. This series was programmed to respond to a pressing problem. Women are woefully underrepresented in theater, design, and technical fields. According to a 2015 study, professional positions nationwide featured men as 86% of the lighting designers, 79% of the scenic designers, and 91% of the sound designers. We are very fortunate that at UMass, all four of our faculty designers are women. But unfortunately, UMass is not representative of the larger field. So over the course of March, the month of March, we've invited four outstanding women designers to share their perspectives, talk about their craft, and offer their inspiration. Over the last 2 weeks, we were lucky to welcome illustrious guest costume and sound designers. And today we have an illustrious lighting designer, followed by the last in our series, a guest scenic designer on Tuesday, March 30th at 1 p.m. I want to give a few thank yous. The series is made possible with support from Women for UMass Amherst. It's a network of alumni that promotes the advancement of campus programs that provide access, support, and opportunity for UMass students, with preference to those projects that positively impact UMass Amherst women and their respective communities. I also have many thanks to give. Big thanks to Anna Maria Gosens, who's been managing house and publicity, to Willow Cohen, who helped conceive of the idea, to my great faculty design colleagues, Amy Altadonna, Yao Chen, Anya Klepikoff, Penny Remsen, to Dee Boyle Clapp, to WFUM and Karen Battistoni, and especially a huge shout out to alum Jordan Mitchell, who was a superstar in helping us secure this grant in the first place. I also want to acknowledge that we gather as the University of Massachusetts Amherst Department of Theater on the traditional land of the Nipmuc, Wabanaki Confederacy, and the Pecumtuck peoples past and present, whose ancient relationships with the land continue to this day. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the people who have stewarded it throughout the generations. Please take a moment to celebrate the resilience and the strength that all Indigenous peoples have shown worldwide. And for those of you who are joining from another location, you can check out the link in the chat to find out more about Indigenous communities where you reside. Now I'm honored to welcome today's host, UMass Professor of Lighting Design, Penny Remsen. Penny has designed everywhere, including New York, Boston, Hartford, Philadelphia, Orlando, Chicago, Knoxville, Houston, San Francisco, Seattle, and Minneapolis, often bringing students with her as assistants to allow them to make career connections. Penny joined the Department of Theater in 1985, and she considers teaching here to be her most important legacy as a lighting designer. Her former students include 3 Tony-nominated Broadway designers, as well as dozens of designers and technicians supporting themselves in regional, international, and New York-based theater careers, and in every other career imaginable. So very pleased to welcome Professor Penny Remsen, who is going to introduce today's special guest.
Thank you, Harley. Uh-oh. Harley, anybody there? Jane?
I'm here. Am I supposed to be on?
Yes, we're supposed
to
be on. Hello.
I thought I was coming on after. I'm here. Hello.
Hello. Thank you, Harley. He went off so quickly. I didn't even know. Anyway, hello. Thank you
Still
all.
here, and I'm saying I'm listening. Okay.
There you go.
All right, I'm going off camera now. You're
doing a terrible show already, Penny.
Oh, it's fine. Thank you, Harley, and welcome everyone who's joining us today. Hi, Jane.
Hi, lovely to be here.
Thank you, honey. I want to introduce Jane Cox, and I'm honored to do so. Jane Cox is a lighting designer for theater, opera, dance, and music. Her recent Broadway designs include King Lear, True West, Jitney, Amelie, and Color Purple. Other recent design work includes Between the World and Me at the Apollo Theater, The Secret Life of Bees at the Atlantic Theater, Fei Fu and Her Friends at Theater for a New Audience, Othello at Shakespeare in the Park, The Marriage of Figaro at the San Francisco Opera, and Row at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, Arena Stage, and Berkeley Rep. Upcoming projects for Jane Cox include Three Sisters at the New York Theater Workshop, Così fan tutte at San Francisco Opera, and Assassins at Classic Stage Company. Jane is also a company member and has been for many, many years for the Monica Bill Barnes Dance Company, a wonderful group of dancers. The recent projects for Monica Bill Barnes is One Night Only at the Women's Project, 3 acts, 2 dancers, 1 radio host with Ira Glass, a museum workout at the Metropolitan, and happy hour, a piece involving karaoke, cocktails, and suits. Jane has been teaching about light and theater design since 2007. And in 2016, she became the director of the program in theater at Princeton University, where she also serves as the artistic producing director of the theater and music theater program series. Jane has been nominated for 2 Tony Awards for her work on Jitney and Machinal, and for 3 Drama Desks for her work on Color Purple, Machinal, and Passion. In 2016, Jane was awarded the Ruth Morley Design Award for the League of Professional Theater Women. And in 2013, she won the Henry Hughes Design Award for her work on Annie Baker's The Flick. Welcome, Jane Cox.
Aw, thank you, Penny. Aw, thank you. And I just want to say thank you. I had a quick look at the attendees while you were talking, and it's delightful to see folks from UMass and people I remember from many, many years ago when I was a student at UMass, as well as folks from Princeton and from Ireland and Arizona. So thank you all for being here. And thank you so much for organizing this series of conversations. Thank you, women, for UMass Amherst. Thank you, UMass Theater Department. And thank you for continuing with this in spite of COVID. It's really an honor to represent lighting coming after Anita Yavich and Jane Shaw, who I love. And I'm a huge fan of Mimi, who's closing the series. And I've had the pleasure of working with all 3 of them. I'm not going to let Penny get off the screen before I thank Penny for her enormous role in my life. I think I'm the only one of these women who graduated. Well, I didn't graduate from UMass, who went to UMass. Is that right? Of your designers? Yeah. I came to UMass Amherst on a junior year abroad a few years ago. And I took Penny's junior baby lighting class. And with her generous and loving approach to life, Penny really changed mine. So it's really moving to me to be back here today. I'm sure many of her former students on the call will recognize that Penny cornered me outside, I don't know if it's the same light lab, but by the elevator there, after our first few classes, to tell me to speak up. And you said to me, I know you have things to say, and you challenged me to find my voice. And you went on pushing, prodding, and scolding me through my early years as a designer. You hired me to assist you, you found me work, you helped me get into graduate school, and you even vetted my boyfriends and current husband.
Most importantly.
Most importantly. And Ben Stanton, who's on the call today, always says, and I always repeat it, thank you, Ben, if Penny told me to be a plumber, I would have done it. It's true. I've been very lucky to be on the receiving end of your fierce generosity and love. So thank you for inviting me back today.
Thank you, hon. Thanks. That was very sweet. We were talking, Jane and I have been talking a lot about, obviously, women in lighting design. And we wanted to actually start this today by naming and honoring our women founders and mentors in lighting design, because women actually pioneered this field. And I want to just name 2 of our founders. Peggy Clark, who was one of the first women to work on Broadway, and Jeannie Rosenthal, who was also worked on Broadway, but also worked with Martha Graham and did amazing lighting design for dance. And then Jane and I talked about who our industry mentors have been. And I just want to name my mentors, and then Jane, I think, is going to name some of hers. I want to shout out to the wonderful, amazing Theron Musser, who had the opportunity to work with Marilyn Renegal, Pat Collins, and Arden Fingerhut.
Beautiful. Well, that's a lovely segue into, John Gleason, who taught me at UMass, at NYU, always said that he noticed me because I reminded him of Arden Fingerhut, who was a very important person in his life. Beverly Emmons was a mentor and an inspiration for me. Roma Flowers is someone I worked with very early in my career who remains an inspiration. And of course, I look up to the work of Jennifer Tipton, Polly Constable, Pat Collins, Kathy Perkins, Natasha Katz, and many other women who've gone before. So thank you. Mm-hmm. Thank you for saying that. One of the things Penny and I talked about is, how lighting design, maybe became a real profession, and then the men took over. I was thinking about that last night and thinking, there's also something that happened in the 80s and 90s when personal computers at home became a thing, and it was sort of marketed as something for boys and men. And I think that has exacerbated a kind of shift away from women in the lighting design field, like the sense that it's a very technical profession. Mm-hmm. Which, it can be, but it can also not be. Mm-hmm. But I was just share one of the things we talked about the other day, Penny, thinking that, I do think that attributes that are sort of generally considered female, whether or not those reside in people who identify as female, are at the heart of good lighting. I think that lighting is about creating emotional tone. It's about responding in an intuitive or creative way to verbal or musical or performance cues. And it's kind of the glue of a project, bringing together performers and space and costumes into one world. So I think that the best lighting designers of all genders are empathic, intuitive, and thoughtful responders. So I've just reflected a lot in that in order for lighting designers to get equal pay, we've had to sort of make the case that lighting is maybe more like set design, and that it has more to do with the sort of narrative framework or structure or conceptual setup for a piece. And it's not that we don't do that, but selling it like that is what allows us to get equal pay to a lighting designer, mm-hmm. which I think when you say what lighting design maybe really is, which is kind of emotional, intuitive responses and mood setting, it starts to sound very feminine. And when you say that, you get paid less. So I've thought about that a lot in the context of like both getting paid and like educational programs and how we market them.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Good point. I'm going to turn it over to you to
All right.
do your thing.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. I'll be back after you finish up with some questions.
Brilliant.
Okay.
Cool. Okay. So I'd be very happy to talk more about my experiences as a woman in this field, either in the Q&A or with the students later on. But today I'd actually love to share what I've been thinking about this year, because it's been on the top of my mind in the absence of being able to make live theater. So I think I'm going to talk for a few minutes, and then I'll share a few pictures with you, and then we'll do some Q&A. So this year, I've been thinking about ideas of darkness and light, and intertwined notions of whiteness, blackness, lightness, and shadow. And I've been wondering about the relationship about how we experience light and dark with our senses, and how these experiences are shaped by our language, English language, and by our culture. and I thought I'd talk about that a bit today. Light and shadow are the basis of how we see, and obviously are the fundamental building blocks of lighting design. Human brains are wired to process the world through the organization of dark and light. We begin this organization as soon as we are born. We shape our view of the world through shadow and light long before we attach language to our sensory perceptions. Babies love to look at highly contrasting images and are interested in black and white before they're interested in color. They're learning how light and shadow give us critical information that we need in order to move our limbs safely, to grasp and hold things so we don't drop them, to recognize faces and people. We become incredibly gifted at visual perception long before we can speak. When you stop to think about it, it's pretty extraordinary how we walk up steps without falling over or learn to recognize faces. And it's only when we hit against hiccups or blind spots in these abilities that we notice how we use perception. For example, when the light hits an uneven floor in a particularly unusual way and we trip, or we fail to recognize a face that we ought to recognize. Or when someone seems to disappear on stage in front of our eyes in a magic show or the Harry Potter play that was on Broadway last year. Our incredible perceptual abilities and the flaws in them are mostly developed while we're still pre-verbal. So this is why so many people struggle to understand how light behaves. It's why consciously learning how light and shadow operate is quite challenging, and why it's difficult for a lighting designer to explain what they're trying to do in language to their director or set designer. The work of understanding light and shadow is deep inside us and mostly subconscious. But putting aside biological perception, darkness and light are also cultural ideas, fraught ideas with enormous baggage in our culture. This year, I've become fascinated with how cultural and linguistic ideas of dark and light might be intertwined with and in conversation with our sensory or theatrical experiences of darkness and light. How much do our ideas about light and dark affect how we make choices as theater makers? I've been blessed this year to have a wonderful partner in these musings, the brilliant MacArthur genius playwright Brandon Jacob Jenkins, who wrote Octoroon, among many other plays. We've been teaching an art-making class together around these ideas at Princeton this semester, and we've been supported in this conversation by an equally brilliant young theater director, Abigail Jean-Baptiste, who is the future of American theater. Both their voices and ideas are in the words that follow, although both of them would say all of it better if they were here. Excuse me. Like most sentient beings, I've been quite focused on the American and global racial reckonings of this year, and of course I'm interested in what this means for theater. I feel that theater is as much a visual storytelling medium as it is an art that you listen to. So I was curious about the racial biases we hold in our visual imagination. As Brandon always says, racism is a structure of oppression that is based on the visual. So Brandon and I decided to teach this art-making class in order to explore theatrical imagery in words and stage pictures and begin to think about what black and white and light and dark might mean in storytelling in our dominant culture. Theater depends heavily on exploiting legible visual tropes, and of course these tropes are populated by cultural ideas and mythologies. Investigating ideas of darkness and light is one aspect of a conversation that I've built my life around, the relationship between sensory experience and language. My fascination with the limits of language and how language does and doesn't correspond to sensory experience has shaped a lifelong love of poetry and dance, sent me to college to study music, and ultimately landed me in lighting design. When I discovered lighting in college and took my first lighting class with the wonderful Penny, I found a medium that allowed me to be constantly engaged in this complex relationship between sensory experience and the English language. My job is often to take a piece of text as spoken by a performer and transform that experience into visual life or reveal it through creating emotional atmosphere and focus. While I'm in a theater creating in this non-verbal medium of light and shadow, I'm constantly explaining what I'm doing using the English language to my collaborators, which is an engaging and sometimes frustrating double act of translation. This year, in the absence of actual theater making, it's been exciting to ask, in the wonderful company of Abigail Brandon and a curious group of Princeton students, how dominant linguistic and cultural ideas about dark and light affect how we actually feel about light and shadow on stage. How much are the choices we make about where we use light and dark in a story related to ideas about what light and dark mean? How separate is sensory experience and visual art making from language and culture, or how much of it is implicated by the racism of that language and culture? Obviously, we live in a dominant culture that has profoundly negative connotations around the language of darkness and mostly positive connotations around ideas of light. There are some pretty famous examples of this, such as the first sentences of the Bible as translated into modern English. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. Plato's allegory of the cave is one of the best-known passages in the history of Western philosophy, in which darkness represents ignorance and light represents knowledge and truth. One of the most succinct reflections on this cultural baggage was written by Ossie Davis, the American actor, director, writer, and activist, in an article he wrote in 1967 called "The English Language is My Enemy." He said this: "A superficial examination of the dictionary reveals the following facts. The word whiteness has 134 synonyms, 44 of which are favorable and pleasing to contemplate, i.e., purity, cleanness, immaculate, bright, shining, ivory fair, clean, clear, chaste, unblemished, innocent, and so on. The word blackness has 120 synonyms, 60 of which are distinctly unfavorable, and none of them even mildly positive. Among the offending 60 were words such as blot, blotch, smut, smudge, sully, begrime, becloud, obscure, dingy, murky, threatening, frowning, foreboding, forbidden, sinister, deadly, unclean, and so on, not to mention 20 synonyms directly related to race." Ossie Davis went on to say, "Any teacher, good or bad, white or black, who uses the English language as a medium of communication is forced to teach a black child 60 ways to despise himself and a white child 60 ways to aid and abet him in this crime." So with this in mind, I'm going to move over to look at some pictures from my own work and talk about this a little bit more in the context of lighting. So bear with me here while I figure out how to get this up on the screen. And does everybody see? Someone send me a note and tell me if they can see. Hopefully, just a big image that says darkness and light. Yeah, great. Thank you. Okay. So here is, so I'll let you know if the pictures are not from my shows, but most of these pictures are from shows that I lit. Here's a theatrical adaptation of The Exorcist, directed by John Doyle, which is an obvious example of an environment in which there are binary relationships between light and dark, good and evil. It's a story steeped in Christian imagery of light and shadow. Oops. Go to the next one here. No. Try that again. Our production starred the wonderful Brooke Shields, seen here with David Wilson Barnes, with sets and costumes by Scott Pask. We're definitely using darkness to create an atmosphere of anxiety, using half light and half shadow on faces to create fear and a sense of foreboding. We're also using specific cultural associations with whiteness in fabric choices to suggest innocence about to be corrupted. In this wonderful production of The Secret Fall of Constance Wilde at the Guthrie Theatre, directed by Marcella Lorca, We used intense light pouring through a set made of intricate metals by Tony Fanning to create complicated dark shadows. The complications of the space rendered in black metal and convoluted darknesses made it hard to see where people were much of the time. It made it hard to understand where the space began and the people ended and began, aided and abetted by the brilliant costumes of Paul Tazwell. Darkness and half-light were used to create threat and enhance the anxiety of the text and the music. On the other hand, I've often used darkness and warmth to create intimacy, such as the bar scene here in Machinal on Broadway on a gorgeous set by S. Devlin. The darkness offers cover for a first experience of romance, a sense of mystery and playfulness. Wonderful costumes here by Michael Crass. This is, of course, a trick used in numerous love stories, including this production of Sondheim's Passion, also directed by John Doyle, and seen here with luxurious costumes by Anne Hold Ward. Darkness allows for intimacy to unfold, seen here in the beginnings of a relationship between Shug Avery and Celia in Color Purple, also on Broadway. Of course, lighting designers also use light as a threatening device in theater. Here, in The Resistible Rise of Arturo Ui, a particular kind of cold, harsh, and very bright light source comes to represent destruction and fascism. Or here, in a production of Timon of Athens at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, lights are used to remind us of prison camps and military installations and are definitely aggressive in tone. Directed by Amanda Dennert. In this same production, death takes place in front of this white sheet on a threatening set by Dan Ostling, costumes by Mara Blumenfeld. In a production of Hamlet that I was lucky enough to do at the Barbican in London with Benedict Cumberbatch, directed by the wonderful director Lindsay Turner, light behaves in all kinds of intimidating ways, operating in a bizarre and unpredictable manner to confuse Hamlet and the audience. We have no idea in this production of Hamlet what is outside the enormous set by S. Devlin, but light punctures the environment in all kinds of threatening and strange ways, sneaks in through mysterious portals, and threatens to upend the entire world of the dysfunctional family within. In the end of the first half of this production of Hamlet, the doors blow open to capture Claudio standing alone in the middle of the space while light and wind pours in, bringing with it black ash that covers all the surfaces. So perhaps there isn't quite the same kind of binary relationship between light and dark and good and bad in theater lighting as there is in our language. Lighting designers use light and dark in both obvious and unexpected ways to harness the audience's imagination and create emotional atmosphere. Maybe lighting can talk back to our dominant culture in some useful ways. What about the debt that U.S. theater lighting owes to the history of Western painting? European and American historical paintings have often taken advantage of the same strong and racist dualism between light and darkness, good and evil, that Ossie Davis calls to our attention. Contemporary Western theater design owes a lot to painting, as anyone who has ever deconstructed a Caravaggio or a Vermeer for a lighting design class will tell you. Often, drawing on Christian metaphors, light represents truth, goodness, and hope, and darkness represents ignorance and danger. Allegorical paintings might offer the most obvious examples of this. Here, in one of Thomas Cole's 19th century paintings representing the stages of human life, light represents goodness and hope, and darkness represents all that is difficult, strange, and hard. For many lighting designers, Caravaggio feels like a most cherished ancestor for the clarity with which he uses light to guide the eye through his paintings. It's important to remember the cultural specificity of this kind of lighting language, which becomes more obvious if you look at, say, Chinese or Japanese painting styles of the same era, which treat ideas of light and atmosphere in very different ways. Caravaggio is also one of the preeminent lovers of dark surfaces. Few people have painted shadows and blackness as lovingly and varyingly as Caravaggio did. In Western art, candles and fire have often represented hope. Darkness has represented death. In George de la Tour's famous painting, the burning candle might represent life, which may flicker out at a moment's notice, or perhaps Magdalene's spiritual enlightenment, another word in the English language that aligns the use of light with positive attributes. An obvious example of how this vocabulary translates to theater is Tennessee Williams' play Glass Menagerie, seen here in a production I lit at the Guthrie. This is a play truly beloved of lighting designers, including myself. It's also a play that equates candles with hope and with illusion. "Blow out your candles, Laura, and so goodbye," says Tom at the end of the play. What about Shakespeare, most beloved and also most vilified, being perhaps one of the greatest bards of the English language and also the original dead white male author whose work perhaps takes up too much space? Of course, Shakespeare was writing in the language of his time, even as he invented new ways to play with it. In Othello, pictured here in a production I lit in Central Park, directed by the brilliant director Ruben Santiago Hudson, Shakespeare takes advantage of racist tropes to get his point across. When Iago tells Brabantio that an old black ram is tupping your white ewe, he chose his words to create a particularly visceral response. This kind of language of light and dark representing good or evil has carried into our popular culture of the 20th and 21st centuries, as well as being buried inside our language. A classic 20th century example is the black hats and white hats of Westerns being used as a handy shorthand for good and evil. This language has been carried into the totally contemporary digital world through ideas about white hats and black hats, here used in relation to hackers with different kinds of intentions. It's been pointed out recently that many of our most beloved contemporary mythologies, from Lord of the Rings to Star Wars, lean heavily into good equals white and bad equals black, or light as innocence and dark as danger. Here's an excerpt from a wonderful article by Teresa Pfeiffer. The colors function as signifiers in a symbiotic relationship in which white knights in shining armor engage in romantic battle over fair maidens. In these idylls of innocence, contrast the shining tradition of courtly love to its evil nemesis, the treacherous Black Knight, his rogue minions of the dark side, the black wizardry of the sorcerer, and the obligatory descent into sadomasochistic dark dungeons. She goes on to say, we find this mythic sensibility especially well developed within daunting duels of lightsabers versus the dark forces of pure evil, embodied in the malefactor Darth Vader, who is encoded by the symbolic framework of stereotypical racism. How much do these storytelling histories intersect with how we create and experience visual environments on stage? That our imagination is populated by cultural tropes seems obvious, but how do our sensory and linguistic imaginations talk to each other? How much does my imagination, populated as it is by the Irish culture I grew up in, and the dominant US culture I'm surrounded by now, lean into these tropes as I make theater? The most exciting tool a lighting designer has, I think, is how light and shadow impact the relationship between the audience and the performer. The lighting designer's ability to disguise and reveal the performer's expressions and emotional experience are at the center of how a story is received. My brilliant husband, Evan Alexander, is an illustrator and 3D artist, and this year he helped me create some images in order to allow me to continue exploring light and dark on the human face with my students, even during this year of Zoom teaching. We decided to create our own images after searching the internet for useful pictures that would demonstrate the use of lighting angles for students, something I would usually demonstrate live in a light lab. We discovered that many of the readily available images use mostly white people as models. We also discovered, as we started making images that are more representative of my student body, that in all the various pieces of software Evan used to create these images, the settings for rendering skin default to rendering light skin. So to create a realistic image of a person with darker skin tone, you have to work harder and it takes longer. So how do light and dark operate on faces with different features and different skin tones? Here we're looking at a front light as a sort of reference point. This front light allows us a view of the eyes, a clear sense of performer's facial expression, and puts us in somewhat of a presentational relationship with the performer. Maybe these people are going to give us a TED talk or sing us a song. Seen like this, it's a theatrical look. The individual lights isolate the performers from each other in their own separate realities. As light starts to move around the face, shadow starts to creep in. The shadow here creates a new emotional atmosphere and a different kind of beauty. The relationship between the light and the darkness gives us a sense of depth and three-dimensionality, revealing the faces perhaps in a more poetic way. We can still mostly see what the facial expressions are, enough to feel comfortable that we understand emotional tone, but perhaps we feel in a more intimate relationship with these people. Here, the shadows fall on the floor in the same line as the people, creating a more intentional relationship between people and space. As light and shadow continue to move around faces and the actors are in side light, they are rendered half in light and half in shadow, and a different sense of mystery is created. Now the audience has to do some of the work. We have to use our imaginations. We're enlisted in the storytelling in a more active way. The greatest tool a lighting designer has is how much we reveal and hide a performer's emotional experience. Figuring out exactly when to reveal and when to give distance from a performer is at the heart of drawing an audience in and enlisting them as an active participant. You need the audience to lean forward in their seats, to shift their attention to their ears from their eyes at just the right moment. Seeing an actor's expression as clearly as possible all the time is rarely the best way to enlist an audience into a story. Sometimes we do want to see every wrinkle around an actor's smile to understand, but sometimes we need to be asked to listen better. Sometimes we identify with people more because we can't see them clearly. Sometimes darkness creates intimacy and emotional engagement. How we wield shadow on a face can give us a different kind of storytelling resonance. A downlight, for example, can remind us of the shadows that might fall from an artificial light in a dark interior space. The unusual shadows from uplight can remind us of the storytelling resonances of campfires, candles, footlights. Shadows can become more important than people, shadow play being, of course, a significant part of many cultural storytelling traditions. Over the last several years, I've also been thinking about how we teach lighting in school and how often lighting education begins with learning to light a pale object in a dark space. I've focused in the last few years on making sure that I'm not teaching lighting that way, that we're lighting objects as well as people of different values from the very beginning of my introductory classes. Surface and light are the same thing from the point of view of our brains. To show you what I mean, in these three images, you'll see the exact same light cue with all the lights at the exact same brightness in three spaces with different tonal values. So here's the light cue in a mid-tone space. Here's the same light cue in a very dark space, like a traditional light lab. In this kind of space with minimal reflections, light seems to act as a kind of independent agent. In a paler space, but in the exact same light cue, light bounces around from one surface to another, creating a multitude of relationships and reflections. Although visual explorations of light may have complexity, the language around light and dark remains stubbornly dualistic in our contemporary English language and in much of our storytelling imaginations. My beginning research into how other cultural imaginations might be populated by light and dark show that this dualism is not universal and in fact is quite culturally specific. I'm obviously not an expert on the history of the world any more than I'm a neuroscientist or a race theorist, but I've learned that many cultures have imagined darkness as representing life. The fertile darkness of the earth in the Fertile Crescent, for example, the darkness of the womb, the darkness needed for germinating seeds that grow into what keeps us alive. Darkness being that which we come from and that which nurtures life. Not all cultures ascribe negative and positive binary attitudes to ideas of lightness and darkness the way we do. So where else might we find a less racist language for talking about light and shadow than the English language currently offers? Or create some breathing room in our imagination around these ideas? In the distant roots of our language, I've learned that the Indo-European origins of the word black actually meant fire, glittering, or flashing. In Old English, black means pale shining as well as dark shining. Black was used as a noun for ink as well as a verb meaning to bleach, a word with many meanings. It wasn't until the Middle Ages that Western cultures instigated a semantic emphasis, associating black and blackness with terror, sin, sorrow, and the devil. The world of fine arts is, of course, full of brilliant artists with visual responses that a lighting designer can learn new ideas from. A recent inspiration for me has been the famous photographer Roy de Carava, whose images of people in New York in the middle of the 20th century are incredible studies in a less binary visual relationship to dark skin tones and surfaces. The artist and writer Teju Cole writes this about de Carava, which really resonated with me as a lighting designer. This confidence in playing in the dark, to borrow a phrase of Toni Morrison's, intensified the emotional content of the pictures. The viewer's eye might at first protest, seeking more conventional contrast, wanting more obvious lighting, but gradually there comes an acceptance of the photograph and its subtle implications. There's more there than we might think, but also when we're looking at others, we might come to the understanding they don't have to give themselves up to us. They are allowed to stay in the shadows if they wish. He goes on to say, these images pose a challenge to another bias in mainstream culture, which is that to make something darker is to make it more dubious. There have been instances when a black face was darkened on the cover of a magazine or in a political ad to cast a literal pall of suspicion over it, just as there have been times when a black face was lightened after a photo shoot with the apparent goal of making it more appealing. Cole says, what could a response to this form of contempt look like? Here's one, an amazing photograph of the musician Elvin Jones on stage. Or the many brilliant photographs of Carrie Mae Weems. In our class, we've been lucky enough to be looking at the work of Glenn Ligon, and he spoke at Princeton, and his explorations of darkness and light in America through language and light have been an inspiration. As a designer, I've also recently taken inspiration from the paintings of the British artist Lynette Yadambochi. Her paintings invite you to lean in and upend ideas of how a subject should be lit. In my graduate education, I was taught that contrast equals interest, and I certainly believe in a critical element of surprise, which is probably at the heart of theater making, a medium that exists in time in a way that purely visual art does not. However, within the visual imagery of theater, I've become more interested in exploring less contrasting visual worlds. Here's a production of Jitney I Lit by August Wilson on Broadway a couple of years ago, directed again by Ruben Santiago Hudson, with clothes by Tony Leslie James and a set by Dave Gallo. Although it's obviously critical that we see the expressions of the performers much of the time, and a stage picture in theater doesn't offer the time for reflection and exploration that an oil painting does, contrast and visibility aren't the most important attributes all the time. I'll end with two photographs from a recent adaptation of the novel of The Secret Life of Bees, which we turned into a musical, directed by Sam Gold at the Atlantic Theatre with costumes by the brilliant Didi Yaite. In this production, I had the chance to explore a glorious variety of warm and dark tones of people and space in a simple and spiritual environment created by Mimi Lien, who you'll get to meet next. As designers, we're often told that there is a way to light subjects for storytelling by directors, artistic directors, producers. Those kinds of statements have always made me bristle a bit. Our visual imaginations and the stories we know how to tell are populated by the cultures we know best. And it's part of our job as theater artists to investigate the lineage and cultural assumptions of the visual and verbal landscapes that we have inherited. Thank you for listening. I'll stop sharing my screen. Here we go.
Thank you, Jane. That's fascinating. I love that. I love what you've been doing in class. I think that's fascinating.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you a question about, you were talking about less contrasting visual worlds.
Yeah.
Because I feel like, you know, I'm always talking about this idea of contrast and making it more visually exciting. And could you talk a little bit about that? What you mean by that? Like,
yeah. No, I you know what? It may be a dangerous thing to say in front of baby lighting designers.
You know, more contrast, more don't use
yeah. Because when I teach young lighting designers, and I'm sure this is true for young lighting designers all over the place, I know it was true for me, there's a tendency to turn everything on at 30%, you know, which I think comes from anxiety about not wanting to have like a point of view, you know, it feels safer if you just put everything on at 30, you know, and that creates a lack of contrast, or, you know, or what they was always called mud, I think, right? Like
apricot jam.
Yeah. And I think it's probably having spent 25 years doing lighting that, you know, I feel like I have the luxury to explore this idea of like dark on dark surfaces or pale on pale surfaces. But I guess I have always pushed back a little on the idea that, and this is not exactly the same thing as what you're asking about contrast, but I've always been a little frustrated by the idea that the best way to experience a performer is always to see everything really clearly. I feel totally confident that that's not true, but it's a real truism of the theater field. That said, that's also a dangerous thing to say in front of a class of new designers, because if you're figuring out what you're doing and you're not sure what you're doing, like, you better have a good reason for not seeing people's faces. So I feel like there's a, you know, sort of spectrum of understanding there. And definitely when I work with young lighting designers, I tell them, like, turn one thing on at full and turn everything else off. But I'm really trying to get them to understand what angle of light does, you know, which is a little bit what we were looking at in part of that talk.
Yeah, that light lab that Evan and you have created is beautiful.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's terrific. That's terrific. Especially trying to teach it, you know, in Zoom, right?
I know. Well, I'm really grateful to him for helping me make something beautiful, because I feel like the experience of standing in a light lab with a real person in front of you and putting light on their face, like, there probably isn't anything more interesting than that.
Absolutely. It's that, you know, it's what Robert Edmund Jones called the livingness of light, right?
Yeah, beautiful.
Like so it's living, and then it's there, and then it's gone immediately, right? So
yeah.
I have a question for you over here. Someone is asking, how do you combine color with this notion of light and dark?
That's a great question. That's the next step. That's the next thing I have to think about. Goodness, I feel like I thought about color. I thought about angle a lot. I thought about color a lot. You know, there's these different components to lighting. As you can see, I'm not going to answer your question directly because I feel like light and shadow is the thing that I've become interested in at the moment. You know, what do those two things do together, and also how they relate to all these questions we're asking ourselves about racism in the American theater. Like, what's the relationship between these two things, which is very slippery and complicated. I guess I would just say to Bianca, color is sort of my first love. You know, color is probably the reason I got into this. I'm sure it's the reason a lot of people get into it. I feel like color is sort of, I want to eat it, you know, I have a very visceral relationship to color. And I think a lot of people do. And so again, when I teach my baby lighting designs, don't actually let them use color for like most of the first semester, because once you go there, it's very emotional in ways that are sort of hard to unpack. That doesn't answer your question at all, but I'm going to leave it there because there's some great other questions in the
Yeah, there's one. Jane, do you have a sense of expectations of people needing to be clearly lit outside of the US? And if those expectations are the same?
I love that question. I mean, I grew up in Ireland. I've worked in Western Europe quite a bit. I have not worked on many other continents. It is definitely true that American lighting leans into seeing more than British, German, French, Irish lighting does. It's definitely true that the sort of norms of stage lighting here involve more visibility of the performer and more general wattage, like just general brightness. Sometimes I feel like to the point where it's actually kind of painful to look at, I sometimes feel. So it is different, and I'm not sure what the reasons are for that.
Do you, there's another question here, Jane. How do you know when a light cue is done or right?
Oh my goodness. You know, I love that you asked that question, because that is a question that we keep trying to ask in this class. You know, we have a bunch of students who are like making theater-y things, making design-y things for the first time. You know, they're not design students taking this class that we're teaching on ideas of light and dark. And we've been thinking about that. I think about that question all the time. I think it's, I can think it's done or right, and then, you know, some set designer sidles over and is like, oh, I hate the way that looks on the roof of my set. Or the director comes over and says, you know, I've always imagined this scene took place in blue and you've lit it in orange, you know. But nonetheless, I do think that there's a feeling that you're chasing, which is maybe similar to feelings that people chase when they're painting or writing poems, or which is like, this is my experience of watching this piece. I mean, I feel like as a lighting designer, you get hired to show the audience the piece the way that you experience it. So, and sometimes that experience is very different to the director. Like you know, my relationship to the performers and which character I think you should be looking at, for example, at a particular moment, it may not always align, you know, with the directors. And that's something we might find out in tech, you know. But what I'm doing is I'm trying to put on stage, I guess, the way I feel when I watch that performer in a sort of non-intentionally lit environment. But I am also, I mean, to go back to the question of contrast, you know, I don't want to knock contrast equals interest, in the sense that, like, contrast in time is critical. You know, there's to be an element of surprise in theater, I think, whether that surprise happens really fast, like they do in a flashy musical, or whether, like, goes on for 3 hours and then there's this tiny surprise and like, you know, other kinds of theater. But like, it's still the surprise is the consistent piece. And that's something that is a little bit like the act of writing one light cue feels like, I mean, if it's allowed to be quite an indulgent act, you know, if you have the time, it's a bit like painting a painting, you know, at incredible speed. But there is this question of like, that I was trying to get at earlier in terms of darkness and light, like how hard am I making the audience work now? Like, when am I getting them used to a way of being with a performer and suddenly I'm giving them some completely other experience of that performer? So that's, I guess, a more cerebral process that happens on top of lighting the scenes kind of moment to moment. But it's been fascinating teaching this class with a playwright. You know, he's never Brandon Jacobs Jenkins never co-taught a class before. And it's really showed up the kind of differences in thought process in a fun way. Like, I really respond to kind of whatever's happening in the moment. And he has like rethought and reorganized like the structure of events that happen in the class, you know, and how one thing relates to something that happens 4 weeks down the line in a way that like, I can't think about theater. Like, that's why I'm not a playwright or a director. Like, I don't want to think about it that way. I want to like feel it in the moment.
One more question, Jane. Do you think there's anything universal about how humans experience light and dark that transcends culture?
That is my big question. You know, that's why I've been thinking about that all year. Well, not all year, my whole life. You know, thank you for asking that. It really goes back to, I think a whole life kind of spent in and around the arts for me has been about trying to understand the relationship between my personal human experience, other people's human experiences as expressed through the arts, through storytelling and music, and you know, which of those things are kind of personal, which are physical, which are cultural. Like, trying to understand that is the thing that kind of makes me tick. So I don't know. I'm gonna go with I don't know.
Good. Good. Oh, Jane, thank you so much, my friend. Really appreciate this. Thank you all for joining us. That's it. Okay.
Yeah, it was delightful. So what do I do now? What do I do? Do I leave? Do I turn it down?
We all leave.
We all leave. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jane.